Harry Melling stars as Edgar Allan Poe in The Pale Blue Eye. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Harry, I wanted to start by asking you, do you happen to remember your first time reading Poe? And if you do, what was that experience like for you?
I remember the first time I heard of Poe was on a Simpsons episode. It's like lots of people mention it as well. It's like a really famous one where I can't remember how it was. I think maybe someone turns into a raven. I can't exactly remember, but that was the first time I heard, oh, who's this Edgar Allan Poe character, this icon of American literature. And I think the first story I read was The Telltale Heart. I think that was the first one that I came across in terms of reading his actual words. But obviously now I feel that I've pretty much not read all of them, but most of them for sure.
Yeah, I imagine that's a great origin story. Let's talk about, I have to imagine it would feel daunting to take on the mantle of playing Poe on screen. So what was your prep process like before production in terms of research or trying to just, inhabit that and not feel too daunted by the task? Because I have to imagine it's a sizable thing to do.
It is, yeah. I mean, luckily I had a bit of time to do this, which is great. Because my initial thinking when I knew I was going to do it was I need to read everything. I need to read as much as I possibly can. And so I obviously, like I said, read his a lot of his works, certainly his earlier stuff as well, which is very different to his later stuff. And I read all the books I could about him from different biographers, which were interestingly very contradictory, I found, which kind of again gave me a sense of this mythology, this mysticism that constantly in my mind shrouded this character of Poe. And then it was going back to the script and working out what was useful and what wasn't, because it, as much as you want it to be as accurate as possible, I felt with this version, I had to have the room to invent, to create stuff, to find a new version of who Edgar Allan Poe is, because, like you said, otherwise I would have been straitjacketed into this, I don't know, giving a version of what I think people would want to see. And I very much thought, no, in this version, we're trying to subvert and challenge that perception somewhat. Um, so that was all a wonderful challenge to kind of get that balancing act between historical fact and then being able to play and enjoy this character.
Yeah, that kind of different angle of Poe that we haven't seen before comes across so well on screen, and it's such a joy to kind of see Poe emerging, the Poe that we know kind of emerge as the film goes on.
I think that's key. We get a sense from early on being very different to how maybe we should expect him to be. And then as the film goes on, we go, oh, I see where this darker, more somber, moodier character comes from. And that was a nice journey to try and pitch and see through.
Exactly. This is a literary adaptation from a novel, and you've done a lot of those over the course of your career. Queen's Gambit, Tragedy of Macbeth, of course, Harry Potter, so many, book to screen adaptations. You were talking about your research process for this reading as much about Poe as you possibly could. What is it like for you working with source material? Do you go back to the novel often? Do you kind of read it once and then just rely on the screenplay? And was that different on this film than any of the other adaptations you've done?
Um, it's weird. I think every film you do that has a literary sort of base, it's a different relationship you have with it. Sometimes you want to steer well clear to try and give yourself more room. On this, I certainly really invested in his own words and his earlier works as well. He did this poem Tamerlane when he was very young, and so I would often dip into that because, I mean, it's a very dense poem. Every sort of line had a page's worth of sort of footnotes explaining what one word meant. So, in a way, that gave me a real insight into how he saw himself as this very intellectual poet, and so that was useful. In terms of Louis Bayard's novel, it was really useful because it's written in the first person. So again, you get an insight into the thinking of these characters. But it can undo you. If you get too attached to certain material, it can unravel you very quickly because you latch onto things that just maybe aren't possible on the day. So it's a balancing act. I think every piece of material that is the sort of the framework for something you're doing. It's a different relationship you have with it, I think.
Yeah, no question. I don't often ask about audition material, but I spoke to Scott Cooper, and he was telling me the story of how you came to the role, and he and Christian Bale watching your audition tape and just marveling at the performance and saying, this is absolutely our Poe. You know, we don't need to look any further. So I wanted to know, something he left out of that story is, do you remember what the sides were for the audition? And what did you, when you saw whatever that material was, what did you kind of tap into and see that you could bring to Poe that obviously, you know, came through on a very challenging, you know, audition tape process?
Yeah, I remember it was the last scene of the film. That was one of the sides, so it was quite a lot. And then it was a tavern scene. So those were the sides that we were given to offer something of this character to. What did I remember? I remember thinking, I have an instinctive response to this person. I have no idea if it's correct or not. But I have an idea of what I'd want to do with him. And often, in a way, I found when I have that feeling, it's worked. I mean, sometimes it doesn't, but it sometimes can work in your favor because it means your response to it is very specific. And what is good about that is when you offer a tape to a director or creative person, if it resonates, it's fantastic because you feel that the offer that my instincts were right, and you can kind of from then you can run away and have fun trying to work out who he is. So that's what I remember thinking. I remember thinking I have a very definite idea of who this man should be, and luckily it resonated with Scott and Christian. So yeah.
I don't want us to divulge anything about that final scene for people who haven't seen the film, but I do want to ask you, because it's so well done and so well plotted, and the final scene really kind of turns a lot of the film on its head. When you read that, when you saw, I guess maybe you didn't see it in the context of the full screenplay, but what was the reaction once you kind of had the full arc of the film? You know, how did you react to it? And did you want to just go back to page one and start, you know, reading the screenplay over again?
Well, you do. I mean, that's your instinct, right? Like, what? Okay, right. You go back and you try and work it all out again. It just took me by surprise. I think that's the common thing that people who've seen it have said. It just you go, wow, okay, and it makes you reevaluate the entire thing in for me a really exciting way, because what people are doing, it's you realize how layered it is, and how, yes, it can be read this way, but with this knowledge, it can be also read a very different way. And I found that a fascinating thing about the film for me. Yeah.
It certainly made me want to go back and restart from the top and rewatch and re-experience with the knowledge that you gain. Let's talk about working with Christian, because the relationship between Landor and Poe, you know, legendary detective and young cadet, is the heart of the film. And the relationship changes so much over the course of the 2 hours. So just talk about working with him on finding those kind of incremental changes in their dynamic, because you know, the journey is really exciting to watch unfold, and you can see it kind of changing, you know, beat by beat.
Well, that's cool to hear. Thank you. Well, working with Christian is just a joy. You know, he's the most generous actor that I've ever worked with. About how we'd work, we wouldn't over discuss things. We would turn up and we'd run the scene for Scott. Scott would come in with his ideas, and then we'd take it from there. Really, there was no big discussions about what has to happen or the important moments of the scene, which is, in a way, I personally prefer that, because sometimes you can talk yourself into a corner and you think, oh no, now I have to do this thing that I've been talking about for weeks, you know, and sometimes that again can put pressure on the scene and on you as an actor. So it was a very nice way of just allowing things to reveal themselves to you without necessarily reaching for them. And I think that's very much how Scott works as well. He's a very delicate, intuitive, specific director. And so I just loved it, you know, I just loved it. Working with Christian was a joy. His listening is impeccable. You know, I don't like the word superpower, but if he did have a superpower, it would be his ability to just listen, and by just listening so carefully, it just draws you into the moment. So yeah, it was the whole situation for me was a dream. And when you work with good people, they just make you better. It's as simple as that. And that was the constant thing that I was experiencing on this film.
I have to imagine those relationships compensated for what Scott Cooper described as a really brutal shoot. I mean, when we were talking, he said, temperatures like -8 degrees, outside, like very challenging conditions. I wanted to ask you about that, just in terms of, I have to imagine it helped set the mood for everybody, really immersing themselves in this environment. But how does that bleed into the performance? I mean, aside from just being physically taxing, which is a challenge to overcome, does that kind of inform, your physicality, or, what kind of effect does it have as you're trying to, get through the pages for the day?
Well, what is good is that you're confronted with the reality of what these characters would have been going through, literally, because it was freezing. And the costumes were beautifully made, but they were made as they would have been made back in the day. So, of course, there's no sort of, secret lining with a load, there's none of that heat technology going on. So it was really cold. I mean, the biggest fear, just on a practical level, was, am I going to get my words out? And Poe had a lot of words. So that was on a practical level, there was that thing to consider. But in terms of actually being in that environment, I feel it helped. I kind of loved it. You get a real sense of the brutality of what these characters would have gone through. There was a harshness in the air. I think every single frame, Massa, who DOP'd it just magnificently, you feel the cold. I saw the film with a friend of mine the other day, and they said, "God, I feel cold," and I thought, "Oh yeah, well, it was cold, but also I think you get a sense of that within the frame of the film. I think it's a real achievement. I think
You do it. It really comes across beautifully on screen. Really kind of sets the tone and the mood for the audience right from the jump. Since you mentioned you just watched it with a friend, I did want to ask you about, it's so striking visually, the film. Are there any shots that you were in that, maybe you didn't know exactly how it would look when you were shooting it, but when you saw it on screen, just kind of really struck you? Because there's so many that, I could mention. I imagine for you that it's the same.
certainly the tavern scenes for me. I think because you're in those settings. There's lots of candlelight. And you don't really, I think, have a perception of what that candlelight does behind the lens. It turns into this weird magic. And those scenes with Patsy behind the tavern bar, and it's all pretty much darkness apart from this light that's just dancing on her face, or with Poe when he's in the corner, and again it's the same thing, and then Landor comes over. I know there's a magic to that and an honesty to it in a weird way. So that really was a pleasant surprise. Although I had every confidence it would look like that, just from being around set and seeing, like, sneaking behind camera at certain points to see what they were conjuring.
I do want to ask you some questions about plot, even though, we don't want to give away too much of the film, or any at all. But something that happens early on that I'd love to ask you about is, Landor, the investigator, comes to Poe kind of with, what he calls, an offer of employment, to help him investigate this murder of a cadet. What is it, do you think, about the offer and about Landor that Poe really latches onto and takes an interest in? What kind of is the kernel that sparks the ember that sparks their relationship?
Well, I think it's arrogance from the top. I think he knows how smart he is, and he wants to show this man just how clever he is. I think that's the sort of instinct, I think. And also, I'm going to slightly play with him as well. And I'm going to let him know that I'm a poet and all these things of what I am. I'm going to let him know. I'm just going to play with this a bit and see where it leads. And then he realizes how smart and clever Landor is, and then is given this offer of employment, like you said. And I think, what Poe searched for his entire life was a sense of belonging and home. And I think, in a way, it's that he realizes could potentially be in this man, Landor, because they're both outsiders in a weird way. They're very different characters, but they're both outsiders. And I think as the story develops, Poe just falls more and more into this sense of home with Landor. But I think from the start, I think it's probably his ego that is his reason for wanting to sort of impress this detective.
Yeah, it's an amazing contrast with one of my favorite scenes of yours, which is just again between you and Landor. There's kind of a confrontation going on, and Poe has to, or kind of reveals maybe for the first time, that he's really suffered a lot of indignities at the hands of his fellow cadets, and has had not an easy time. I think it's just such a beautifully realized scene and performance. And I just wanted to ask you about, what do you, when you see that on the page, I know you have to do that and kind of go there, what do you kind of access, and how do you prepare yourself to do something really that emotionally honest and raw?
Well, I remember reading that scene and thinking this is one of the times where a big layer of skin, you really see inside this man at this moment, and it's because he's pushed to that. And I thought that was very telling, certainly in terms of where we begin with Poe in more of a performance mode. He's trying to impress people. He's trying to find a sense of who he is within this military world. And then in this moment, I think you see right through him. So I remember thinking there has to be, like you said, hopefully a real honesty to it, and a moment of revealing something that he doesn't do often. And how do you, I don't, I mean, it's in the words. You just try and be as truthful as you can, really. And when you've got Christian there who's probing you to tell me the truth, and it comes out. And I think that's the golden space of acting, is when it's not too, you're not thinking about it too much. It just kind of reveals itself and you're there. And I think hopefully that moment is a moment where we really understand who Poe is.
And no question. Before I let you go, Harry, I do want to ask you too about the ensemble that you're working with on this film. Not just Christian, but I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches in terms of the character actors and real legends on the screen. Robert Duvall, Gillian Anderson, Toby Jones, Timothy Spall, Harry Lawty, your contemporary. Just talk about coming to set every day and getting to work with them and so many others that I could mention. What is that like? Just to work with one after another of just wonderful character actors.
Well, they just make you better, don't they? They elevate you into a different space of, I don't know why it happens, but it just does. You work with these people who are so gifted, and you just have to raise your game to meet them. I mean, the list, like you said, is endless. I mean, I had a day on set with Robert Duvall and Christian Bale, and I had to step away and think, what? This is incredible. And yeah, I mean, every day was a joy to come onto set, because everyone was so willing to create something special. There was a generosity to everyone and to what they wanted to offer. And yeah, and it makes you better. I mean, that's the biggest compliment I can really pay those other wonderful actors.
Harry Melling, congratulations on the Pale Blue Eye. Thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Thank you so much, pal. Thank you.